We did an event here a few weeks ago for the historian Ben Smith. He wrote this new book about the drug trade in Mexico, the dope, British guy. And he gave this talk at Hopkins beforehand, like did a kind of similar thing. He gave like an undergrad lecture at Hopkins, and there was somebody in the
Okay, I think we're going to go ahead and get started, everybody. Thank you all for coming. Welcome to Red Emma's. Is anybody here for the first time? Oh, awesome. So we are a worker-owned radical bookstore, restaurant, cafe, event space. We've been open since like 2004. So it's like approaching that 2-decade status where you're like, oh shit, we're an institution. So I don't know what to do about that. I do know I'm kind of tired. Because it's been a lot. We bought these buildings, we've been renovating them, we've been fighting the city on permits, we've been fighting, all sorts of structural things that were surprising to us after we bought them. But we're finally mostly open. The bookstore is downstairs and it's great. It's gonna move and it's gonna be even better because we're renovating a 2-story building next door that'll become the new bookstore. And then that space downstairs will become an organizing space, meeting space, classroom space, rental space. So super, super excited about that. And just generally excited that, we've reached a point, like both in terms of our physical space, but also in terms of, the ongoing pandemic, that we feel comfortable actually welcoming people into the space to talk about ideas, to talk about books, to bring authors to town and to meet in person. Like in an age when so much of our kind of online communication is both omnipresent, but also like threatening to fall apart at any moment, I think being able to bring ourselves together in person is really incredibly, incredibly important. So in terms of events, one of the things that I'm really excited about with events in this new space is not just the amazing people we have here, but the chairs. Because I really love these chairs. Because they've given us this kind of vibe of like, two cool people in conversation with each other, which I think is just an amazing, amazing fit for bookstore events. And I won't go through all the events we've got coming up because there's a lot. But I do want to mention one conversation we just scheduled that I'm super excited about. This is also awkward because the person who is going to be part of that conversation just walked in. So luckily you've got a mask on, so I won't see you blushing. But Maximilian Alvarez, who's the editor-in-chief of the Real News Network, has written a wonderful book of interviews called The Work of Living, looking at people's experiences across all different walks of life, but really works of life, in the first months of the pandemic. He's going to be in conversation on December 15th with Jamie McCallum, who's written a book called Essential. Jamie, who I've known for a really, really long time, like from the sort of weird, radical, quasi-academic punk life scene of, at least the last 2 decades, is a really incredible sociologist of labor. So that's going to be just a really, theoretically rich and beautiful conversation that I'm really looking forward to. So please mark your calendars for December 15th. You'll get to see these chairs in action again. We've got lots of other stuff coming up as well, though, so please do check that out. But tonight, I am super thrilled to welcome Christina Heatherton, professor at Trinity College, back to Baltimore. I think she was last year, I want to say like maybe 2009 or something.
Before time.
Yeah, like for a great book called Policing the Planet. But she's back now with this remarkable piece of historical scholarship, Arise, it's just a really fantastic unpacking of how, a historical event that we thought was really maybe, a story about something that happened in one place is actually a story about global flows, not just of capital and power, but also of resistance and revolt and insurrection and radical imagination. And it's just a really remarkable, surprising story full of like all the great kind of like surprising, wonderful detail that really bring that kind of experience of a historical transformation to life. So I'm really excited to have her here. I'm also excited that we get to welcome Christy Thornton, whose book came out during the pandemic, so we didn't get to do a book launch for her, which makes me really sad. So this is like a consolation prize, I guess. But beyond that, it's also really, really appropriate because Christy's work, her book, Revolution in Development, really takes the same object, right, the Mexican Revolution, but looks at it not like kind of in its formation and its when it was happening, but looks like at its legacy and looks at the way its legacy was a global event, right, tied up with all of the sort of really interesting conversations around the emergence of the neoliberal world order, and really kind of highlights a space of contestation against that kind of process, one with limitations and contradictions, but really complicating in a really rich way our understanding of what like the Washington consensus was, right? And it wasn't just forged in Washington, right? The point of hegemony, right, is that actually you're not in charge and you have to kind of maneuver to make that happen. And so that history really is it's a complementary one. It does something, I've been trying to figure out how to describe it, like some sort of visual metaphor, but both of these books kind of take this historical moment of the Mexican Revolution and like really explode it in a really interesting way spatially. So I think this conversation is going to be really fantastic, and I'm really glad that you all are here and that we had a chance to put these two in conversation together about their work. Thank you, and
Thanks,
join
John.
me in welcoming them.
Okay, so I have just come up with a set of questions here that are going to basically allow Christina to tell us about the incredible stories that she's uncovered here. But before we get into those kinds of the kind of historical specifics, I wanted to ask a first kind of framing question about how you came to even know how to ask the questions about this, right? How you even came to this story, because so I'm a historian of Mexico, and historians of Mexico have long thought and long sort of written and described the Mexican Revolution as a deeply nationalist movement, right? As a movement that is deeply about Mexican things, that reverberates within Mexico, but doesn't really go far beyond that. And in some ways, this is about the kind of historical legacies and hangover of contemporary and subsequent revolutions, right? So there is no Comintern in Mexico. There is no sense in which the Mexican Revolution is trying to kind of export itself abroad. There isn't even the kinds of things that will happen after the Cuban Revolution with support for liberation struggles in places like Angola, right? So for that reason, historians have long sort of looked back at the Mexican Revolution and said, okay, this was a nationalist revolution, and maybe it didn't have the kind of world historical impact that these other more internationalist revolutions did. The kind of dean of the historiography of Mexico, this guy Alan Knight in Cambridge, makes this kind of explicit case, right? This is not the kind of revolution of world historical import. It is this nationalist thing. And so I wonder, given that, right, how did you even start to think about finding these entanglements and understanding the Mexican Revolution as this internationalist moment? Where did that come from for you?
Cool. Okay, all right. Hi, everybody. Can you hear me? All right. First, just real quick, thank you all for coming. It's Wednesday. Who wants to listen to a book talk on Wednesday? I really appreciate it. And it's also just like, it's such an honor to be here at Ren Emma's. John told me that you refurbished the whole place for my visit, so I really appreciate that. And also, it's such an honor to be in dialogue with Christy, who is the biggest badass in my field. I was so intimidated the first time I met her because I had been getting emails from you from NACLA for a really long time, and I'm still intimidated, so I'm trying to keep it cool. So how did this come to be? I'm going to just tell you two stories about how this happened. And I guess the first is that my family's Okinawan on my mom's side, well, Okinawan and Japanese, and I was interviewing a relative about the Japanese-American internment, which I hope everybody here is familiar with because I don't have time to explain it if you didn't. So one of my uncles said, well, my father was he was a farm worker and an organizer in the Imperial Valley, which is on the border with Mexico in Southern California. And he said, you know, my father could speak Japanese, Okinawan dialects. He could also speak English, and he could speak Spanish. So he was a really well-placed organizer. And, you know, before the formal internment, there were these FBI raids where they targeted all these organizers. So they targeted my great uncle. And so his son, my uncle, tells me, well, you know, these feds came to the door, but he had been down with Pancho Villa in them, so he knew how to take care of business. And if he was going down, he was going to take those MFers down with him, right? So I was like, wait, what? You know, like, I mean, the story challenged a lot, right? I was like, why would someone from Okinawa, and a lot of my family came from Okinawa through Mexico illegally into the US. You know, like, first I had to think, like, well, that kind of reroutes what I was taught about Asian American history, and particularly Okinawan and Japanese American history. You know, and I was like, that's a kind of interesting other chapter of just what I thought I knew. But then I had to really think about the question of, like, why would an Okinawan peasant find affinity and solidarity with somebody from Mexico during their revolution? And that threw me into a different direction. The second story I'll tell you really briefly is that my father married a flight attendant. Oh God, there's probably a better way into that story. But this meant for a brief period of time, I was the child of a flight attendant and I could fly for free. So through a lot of chaos, I ended up in Bristol, England, that we were just talking about. And I helped start a radical history group there. And so we did a lot of events, particularly around the 200th anniversary of the abolition of the British slave trade, because the country was like celebrating, you know, it was just really feeling itself. Oh, William Wilberforce, oh, we're so good and we're so worthy. And, you know, I mean, there's huge Afro-Caribbean populations there. There's a huge sense of the history of struggle. There's a huge sense that freedom was never something that was just granted by the state. It was something won by people in struggle. So we put on all kinds of public events. We had guerrilla theater. We had, like, kids events. We had, you know, we just kind of, like, nobody had any money. I was the closest thing to an academic because I had a semester of graduate school behind me. Everybody was like a bartender, a contractor, an elementary school teacher, and we put together all these events, and I had a really firm sense of how hungry people were for a history of, you know, what people called history from below, but particularly this sense of abolitionist histories in the Atlantic world that were global, that were interconnected. So when my when my uncle told me this story, I was like, oh, maybe there's a kind of, like, parallel you know, a story to tell about the Pacific. And I wonder if it's routed through Mexico. And that was a kind of genesis for it. And once I started digging, well, that's what happened, so.
Yeah, that's great. So this is a work of history. It's, you know, deeply researched. You've been in archives all over the world. You're using publications from all over. And so one of the questions that I want to kind of pose here, and, you know, looking at the incredible blurbs on the back of the book about the way that this should be used, right, about the lessons that it gives us, is sort of why you think learning this history, recovering this history is important today. So near the end of the book, you write, "The study of internationalism is always a reckoning with an unbidden inheritance." And so I wonder what you mean by that, and what we should take from this inheritance, and why learning this history of this kind of forgotten internationalism is so important.
Yeah, you see what a hot seat this is? These are like real questions. Let me say something about nostalgia, because I think there's a lot of ways we could talk about that, and I'd actually be curious, you know, like how you think about that. But I think that, you know, nostalgia sometimes tells you so much more about the period within which it's generated rather than the period that it's, you know, referring to. And I think there's such difficulty in thinking about radical history because all the ways that it's captured. So for example, at this moment, it's the, you know, this is the 200th anniversary of the birth of Harriet Tubman, and to celebrate it, the CIA put a statue of her in front of their headquarters in Langley, Virginia, because they want to recruit more, you know, minorities, they said. And, you know, like, there have been all these weird plans by the Treasury Department to put her face on currency, on a $20 bill, which we could talk a lot about, you know, how deep that is, and how deep it is that it was for a forged $20 bill that George Floyd was killed, right? And just, so I have a lot of thoughts about that. But I say that because I think there's you know, when we think about radical history, we have to think about how revolutionaries are often conscripted to become mascots for the very states that they often were invested in overthrowing. This year is the 100th anniversary of the death of Ricardo Flores Magón, right? And so in Mexico, in January, the president declared this the year of Ricardo Flores Magón, and there's this really deep kind of irony behind the way the state is trying to incorporate this revolutionary figure who, apologies for not explaining, Ricardo Flores Magón, you know, one of the most famous anarchists, anarcho-syndicalists, you know, that comes out of the revolution. He's called by the state the precursor to the Mexican Revolution. That's on the banner for this year of Ricardo Flores Magón. Now, what's so deep about this is, as many of you know, 43 students were kidnapped and killed from a rural school in Ayotzinapa. And these recent allegations, well, no, I mean, recent investigations have concluded that there was state complicity in it. So those students' classmates and their parents have participated in something that's a long tradition in Ayotzinapa to organize in a committee. And what's that committee called? The Ricardo Flores Magón Committee. So you have the Ricardo Flores Magón is both the incorporated revolutionary of the state confronting his living legacy, right, as a revolutionary that still like motivates and galvanizes people in the country. And I think this is just a really interesting way of like, why do we return to this history? Because if we don't, it's taken from us and parceled back to us in ways that I think are like illegible to the lives and struggles of the people themselves. So, you know, I mean, this is not just a biography of like, here's the true story of the revolutionaries, but it's an approach, it's a way, you know, I hope it's something of an invitation to say like, this is our history. This is a history that's only alive in struggle, and a lot of what we have, you know, to kind of contend with are all the various forms of incorporation, all the various ways that nostalgia can trap us, you know, and prevent it from actually helping us fight.
Yeah, gosh, that question of recovering histories from the Mexican Revolution forward, when the state project that gets built out of that is one that then incorporates the revolution with a capital R kind of officially moving forward and becomes a single party authoritarian state for the entirety of the 20th century.
I bet you know something about that.
So yeah, obviously the kind of question of how that is remembered is so important and not remembered. I want to drill down on the specificity of Mexico and the Mexican Revolution just a little bit. And obviously this is something that I have also thought about. So you write on page 54, you have this thing where you say, in the era of its revolution, Mexico represented multiple configurations of space. It was simultaneously a fixed place on a map, a place made meaningful relative to the places it bordered or was connected to through roads, rails, and ports, and it was also an imagined space upon which multiple competing fantasies were projected. And I think that's a really interesting way of thinking about the role that Mexico plays, thinking about this sentence, what Mexico means to us here in the United States, right? Thinking about how we understand the importance of Mexico to quote unquote American history, right? To US history. And I wonder what you think about that. How do you think about the place of Mexico in thinking about the history of this thing that we now occupy called the United States?
Right. Wow. Okay. Well, first off, that kind of like, you know, it's a place on a map. It's a place made meaning relative to the things it borders, and it's also a place onto which like imaginaries were projected. So this is kind of, this is so obnoxious, but I'm going to do this. So this is kind of a gloss on Lefebvre's tripartite of space, right? This idea that space is both abstract. It can be a place on the map. It's also, I'm going to mix this up, relational in the sense that, or is that relative? It's made meaning, you know, full in terms of the spaces it borders, and then it's also, I think the last one is relational in the sense that there's also a way in which it comes into being. And the kind of example people give is like, you know, so we are abstractly all in this room together, like depending on where you are relative to the sound of my voice, you're having different experiences of this conversation. And you could be thinking about all kinds of other things in your head, that what are you going to make for dinner, that you're really tired, right? And so all those things are happening at the same time. And I thought that was a useful way, given what I was encountering in the archive, to be able to say, like, look, we're talking about a relationship to the Mexican Revolution, but there's multiple ways in, right? So this question specifically about Mexico in relationship to the U.S. I grew up in Southern California, right? And so this is always a question, where does the U.S. end and Mexico begins? That's a very fluid question in Southern California. So, I think what was really deep for me in coming to this literature was seeing that in histories of Mexico, there's always this language of state formation. But when I was, I try to think about that in relationship to the evolving political economy of the United States. And I felt, you'd probably know better than I, but I felt like there was this kind of sense, even in the history, that the U.S. was always going to become the thing that it became, right? And so there's just this kind of knee-jerk way in which, like empire infects the very narration of history. So Mexico is understood with all these contingencies. It's narrated often, particularly, by many historians, English-speaking historians not, in Mexico, as something that kind of like it's a junior partner, right? It's something always understood in a somewhat subordinate way to the United States. Some of this is material, as I say in the book. The first time the U.S. becomes a creditor is in relationship to Mexico, right? Huge fortunes are made in the United States in Mexico. By the outbreak of the revolution, like, what is it, a quarter almost of all U.S. investments are in Mexico. So there's a very similar way that Du Bois talks about the wealth of nations, like how they're produced in relationship to the underdevelopment of the world, to slavery. Like, you can't understand, he says, the palaces of Versailles, right, without understanding slavery. It's not that they're two different worlds, one produces the other. And that's, in just as one way of kind of inverting that really paternalistic view of Mexican history in the United States. Like, Mexico built the United States. So I think when you grapple with that, and like I say in the book, when you center 1848 as the central pivot of the global economy and of the U.S. coming into being, hell, like, over a third of Mexico's territory is taken by the United States with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo at the end of the Mexican-Mexican War. So, like, U.S. is literally a creation of Mexico. And I think, like, if you can start there, everything looks different.
I think that's right. I didn't go to L.A. until after I'd already spent a lot of time in Mexico. And when I got to L.A. for the first time, I was like, oh, I'm still in Mexico. Like, that's what this is. Like, I was like, I knew this intellectually, but I could, like, feel it in a way that was really different. So I want to ask you to talk a little bit about some of the specific people and stories and convergence spaces, as you label them in this book. And there's so many in the book. Like, the actual stories, the narratives of these people that come out are so rich. So yesterday we got to spend a lot of time talking about Elizabeth Catlett, the famous African-American artist who goes to Mexico in the 1940s, and she sees there parallels between the Mexican Revolutionary struggle and the Black freedom struggle in the United States, and makes art that really illustrates that incredibly well. And there are plates in the book of Catlett's art that put these things next to Mexican art. It's just incredible. And we had the chance yesterday to go to the Baltimore Museum of Art and see some of the original prints. And
I only stole 2 pictures.
So there's Elizabeth Catlett. There's Dorothy Healy, an incredible labor organizer in Southern California who works with Mexican agricultural workers who bring their own traditions from and memories of the revolution into the fields, into the struggle. So I want to ask you to talk about a few of these in more detail, and I'm going to start with M.N. Roy. I've always been really fascinated by M.N. Roy, and so I was really excited to read what you have to say about him. And I think one of the things, the way that you write about him here has such interesting implications for debates we're having today, things that still recur on the left, particularly about And it's crazy because this is literally 100 years ago, right? But particularly about the question of organizing along class-based lines versus recognizing other forms of identity and oppression and putting those together. So you have this great line about Roy, who of course is an Indian national, founder of the Mexican Communist Party. You say he produces a synthesis between the color line and the class struggle. So I wonder if you can tell us about that and how he saw the world from Mexico.
Sure, happily. Let me say this first. I think some of the ways we can understand some of the kind of chaos of revolutionary movements at the period is just to point out some really interesting facts. Ho Chi Minh was one of the founding member of the French Communist Party. Sen Katayama, who was a Japanese radical, was one of the founders of the CPUSA. And M.N. Roy, who, that's not his real name, it's the name that he adopted, was from India. He was a staunch fighter against British colonialism. Well, he's one of the founders of the Mexican Communist Party, right? So he's a totally fascinating figure. He was on, a part of a kind of global search for arms and support for the fight against British colonialism. And in the chaos of World War I, he ends up in Mexico in 1917. And he tells this incredible story about how he's like trying to find his feet. His memoirs are published if anybody's interested in it. And, some of his comrades, this usually happens, some of his comrades are journalists. All power to the journalists. And they're like, okay, MN, like, why don't you tell people in Mexico about your struggle, about the struggle of Indian people against British colonialism? And so he sits down to write, and he narrates in his memoir, he says, it's very cute, he says, he suddenly realized that explaining colonialism to people in Mexico would be like carrying coal to Newcastle, right? And he's like, wait a second, I'm not explaining something they don't already know. Like, this is very resonant with what people's experience here already is. And so he says, he calls Mexico the land of my rebirth because he goes from a specific kind of diehard nationalist into an internationalist. And these are the kind of steps that precede him becoming one of the founders of the Mexican Communist Party. So what's really deep about Roy is if people know about him who know left history, he's very famous for a debate he had with Lenin in the Comintern around the national and colonial question, right? And Roy's argument, just very briefly, was like, okay, so workers of the world unite, but in the colonies, like, it's got to be the petty bourgeoisie because somehow the workers aren't of sufficient, maturity. Like, he's like, how condescending is that? So his whole argument, I mean, I'm dramatizing it. It's Red Emma's. So he's, he makes these really important interventions in conversation with Lenin. And what's so interesting is if you go back to them, he's working most of that out in these articles that he's writing in Mexico, right? And so he's really kind of forcing a rethinking of how is the Comintern grappling with the question of colonialism, but he's also, I think, really putting a finger on the implicit racism, right? The kind of developmental logic that, well, some countries just aren't ready to go at it alone by being like, why the difference? So, I mean, I say in the book, like, this is no dusty detail dredged from the annals of left history. This is like, I think it blows a lot of people's mind to just be able to see 100 years ago, people were trying to produce syntheses of the kind of struggles we imagine are new today. Like a lot of times if you're talking about Marxism, people will be like, but colonialism, right? As if, well, people have tried to think about these things together. So, I mean, part of bringing Roy into the conversation was to be able to say, like, look at this convergence, look at these new syntheses, these new articulations of struggle, and look how much they have to teach us now.
That's great. You also have this really incredible argument in the book that, again, another thing that is just super resonant with the way, with things that we're thinking about today. You have this really incredible argument about the time that Ricardo Flores Magón spends in the Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary. And which you characterize the Leavenworth, not merely as a prison, but in fact as what you call a university of radicalism. So I want you to tell us about Flores Magón and his time in this place, why he ended up there, and then think through how you could have this space of just incredible violence and repression, but have it also be turned into this remarkable space for organizing and resistance, and think about the way that that is resonant with things that are going on even today in the prisons and jails here in the United States.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, to answer the last part of the question first, like, when has it not?
Yeah.
You know, I mean, like, organizing, if organizing came out of comfortable, you know, conditions, then there'd be a lot more comfortable people doing a lot more organizing, you know? But Max knows, your book's fantastic, by the way, you know, like, people who are organizing knows that it's, people have only tried to survive and give each other during World War I because they had this consistent problem of all these people getting arrested as criminals and then being released as organizers. So what happened in the prison? Well, I was interested in Leavenworth because I thought it was this totally crazy detail that Ricardo Flores Magón, you know, the great hero of the Mexican Revolution, died in Kansas, right? So I went to the National Archives in the Central Plains region in Kansas City, Missouri, just to be able to see, like, just who were the Mexican revolutionaries there. I knew his comrade, Librado Rivera, was there. I knew his brother, Enrique Flores Magón, was there, and I just wanted to be able to piece that together. But in the process of looking, all of a sudden I realized everybody was there, right? Wobblies who had organized against the draft were there. There were socialists, communists, pacifists, you know, Quaker pacifists, like, you know, and other Indian nationalists, you know, who were fighting against British colonialism. Everybody was there, and part of this was due to new legislation that was passed in this period, the Espionage and Sedition Act, right, which made it a federal crime. Political dissent was a federal crime, so everybody was sent to this federal prison. And lo and behold, you put people together, and what fucking happens? They organize, right? And so I was so amazed to be able to see, like, they, you know, the prisoners are ordering, you know, magazines, periodicals, newspapers from around the world. They're ordering textbooks. They're ordering, you know, multi-language dictionaries. And they had organized their own university. They organized their own university, right? Because they had all these radicals together, and they started talking to each other. And actually, what some of them said was it was because they were organizing in the prison. This is usually how it goes. Because they were organizing, they realized they had to educate each other. And so, you know, and it's very interesting. Enrique Flores Magón, he taught Spanish, but he also taught about the history of the Mexican Revolution. So the prisoners made their own newspaper, and he had a column called the Mexican Kaleidoscope, where he would kind of narrate the history of the Mexican Revolution for people who had no relationship to it, but as a way of going, like, you need to understand this history to understand why we're all in this together. I went to his great-grandson just opened an archive of all his materials, and so his library's there. And I love this detail that there's a copy of Louise Bryant. Anybody seen Reds? No? Okay, all right, okay, all right. Bad. This is how I teach, you know? Do you know this arcane reference? No? So Louise Bryant was John Reed's partner. This is a terrible way to describe her, but she was this socialist feminist journalist, and she wrote this book called 6 Red Months in Russia. And so you open the book, and it's got Enrique's name and his inmate number, but you turn the page, and it says, "Dear fellow prisoners, do not, please be prompt in returning this book, and do not write in its pages because there are so many other people waiting to read it." So you're like, why were all these people reading this book about feminists in Russia? So anyway, so I tell the story of this University of Radicalism, Leavenworth Penitentiary. That's the 3rd chapter, How to Make a University.
That's awesome. Yeah, I love that chapter, and I love the entire, I mean, the idea of the convergence space is a really important one in this book, and you can see very clearly kind of within walls erected by state violence that this is this kind of a convergence space. Can you talk a little bit about that idea and how you find other convergence spaces that are maybe less brick by brick than that particular one is?
Sure. So the idea of a convergent space is, I mean, I think Leavenworth provides the kind of perfect, like, way of materializing the example, right? So it's it's a site where different radical traditions get compressed and produce new articulations of struggle. And really, this just came about from understanding how organizing happens, right? You know, I mean, I saw this really interesting, I was a part of this meeting with all these restaurant workers who were organizing, and the first thing they said was like, look, I mean, we all have lives and histories that precede our time in this country. We come out of our own revolutionary traditions. So you think when we come and try to figure out how to stop a boss from stealing our tips or like totally exploiting us, you think we're not drawing on that, right? So, I mean, I think this is something that happens all the time, but we don't always understand it as such. And I think one important thing that I just kind of wanted to re-articulate was like, this is how theory happens, right? This happens all the time in struggle where people are trying to make sense of like, what are the things that they bring to the table? And like, how do you use those different tools in struggle, right? And what happens as a result? So I forgot the rest of your question, but that's what a convergent space is.
That's great. I'm going to ask one last question, and then we'll turn it over to the members of the audience. So in John's introduction, he made the case that, this book is really important for thinking about internationalism today, and I do think that is very much the case. In the conclusion of the book, you have this kind of particular amazing gloss on Du Bois that I think is, and Frederick Douglass, that I think is really important. You say this thing, you say, they saw the color line as a political project rather than an ontological condition. It had been organized, and so they believed it could be organized against and overcome. Following their lead, this book argues that the color line is less a physical demarcation to be traced and more a political project to be overcome. It calls for a different form of making. And so I wonder, in thinking about those different forms of making and thinking about the vehicle, the necessity of internationalism today, I wonder how you think about the kinds of barriers that are in place to our own kind of internationalism, because in some ways it seems obvious that it should be easier, right? We have, we have these little magic machines in our pockets that will show us, people pouring onto the streets in Sao Paulo after Lula wins. They will show us, repression that's going on in Russia as it's happening. That, so we have in that way the kind of tools of seeing one another, of talking to one another, and yet somehow in our struggles, internationalism feels kind of harder than ever. And so I wonder what you think about that and about the idea of internationalism in this new kind of making that you're calling for.
Thanks for that. And I'm going to address a part of the question. It's not all of it. And I am genuinely curious about how other people in this room approach that question. And I want to say first off that I think that some of the paternalism and just how we imagine other people, other countries, something that you cover extraordinarily well in your book, Revolution in Development, for sale on the counter over there. Everybody should buy it and get Christy to sign it. Is something that I think you really help us disentangle. But I suppose the small part of that I'll chew off is the question of the color line, right? Which is something that we forget. Frederick Douglass was, one of the early people who used that term in an article, and he has this great passage that I think I quote in the book, where he's like, if you think that this is just natural, basically, if you think racism is just natural, if it's embodied, and then it's as pointless to organize against it as it is to tell a fish to stop swimming or a bird to stop flying, then you're kind of part of the problem, right? And so I think that there's really interesting ways that we don't always give Douglass and Du Bois the kind of credit for being such generative and expansive thinkers. There's kind of, this is sort of an effect of the nostalgia I was talking about earlier. There's a way in which, Douglass gets understood as someone who's just talking about anti-Black racism when, he's writing about Mexico, he's writing about indigenous genocide, he's writing about Ireland, he's writing about Wales, he's speaking all over the world, and I talk a little bit about that in one of the chapters too. And, Du Bois, in a slightly later period is really trying to wrestle with this question. He makes this really important argument. He talks about the kind of political, the transformations of the political economy that are coming into being, like, as I argue, I think in relationship to Mexico. And, he calls it a kind of democratized despotism. So this is the idea that, well, a long time ago it was only the kings who were able to amass wealth. But now, under the particular kind of phase of finance capital, it's democratized, right? Every working man can share the spoils of empire, right? But not every working man, right? And so the way he's talking about the color line isn't just this kind of like, here's this demarcation of white people are like this and black people like this and Mexican, it's not a physical line. He says you have to understand its co-evolution with this particular, and I talk about how Arrighi describes this as this is this systemic cycle of accumulation within which the U.S. becomes hegemonic. And Du Bois is, so all this kind of to say that Du Bois is like, look, there's this idea that some people feel like they are these small princelings of empire, that they can be as rich as a Carnegie if they look at Mexico the way Carnegie does, if they look at the Congo, the way King Leopold and the rubber companies do. And so Du Bois is actually very interested in particularly this project. This is not natural, this is cultivated, right? And it's incredibly powerful. And oh my God, it continues to be so powerful and so seductive. People who feel powerless gravitate to, notions of security and power. So, this continues to be a major question for this moment because, in this country, the just violent white nationalism that's coalescing. In other countries, the kind of violent nationalism that's coalescing isn't necessarily around white supremacy. If you're looking at India, if you're looking at the Philippines, they take other forms. But I think the sense, in a moment of powerlessness, that this is something that gives people a false sense of power is something that Du Bois talked about a long time ago. And if we do not get this right, as in, this is something that can be changed, but we have to have the confidence and the faith that this is not ontological. You are not born with a race. You are not born with racism. It was organized. It can be organized against. So I think that's a really important lesson for this moment.
Great. I think that's a great place to end. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, we definitely have time for some questions. Who's got one? I'll come to you with a mic.
Anything you ever wanted to know about Mexico and were afraid to ask?
Wow. Like talented and stuff like that. How do you get out of the way of being a mascot when you trying to really just help your people and get them out of the way of certain things they might not be aware of, you know what I'm saying, in their head, and not trying to be a part of something that you ain't signed up for, which I'm actually going through as we speak. You know what I'm saying? How would you go about that? You know what I'm saying? And just kind of being low key to myself, but more so the people that understand,
yes,
and people that don't, they don't. You know what I'm saying? What I'm actually going through and, who I might be or who I might know and that type of shit, that don't really fucking matter to me. But how do you get out of being a mascot for a city when you're really trying to just help a certain type of people, you know what I'm saying? And then whoever comes along. You know what I mean? And whoever decides to help. You know what I'm saying? How do you go about that in a respectful way, but not it's not a damaging way, but a respectful way. But it'd be like, yo, still, you need to chill out with kind of like keep coming at me, like, you know what I'm saying?
That's a real question. I appreciate that. I would just say, you are never what anybody else makes you to be in, right? And I mean, like, if you're at the point where people are trying to incorporate you in the way that we've been talking about, it's because you're doing serious work, right? And so, I mean, this is always a challenge. Like, I mean, I can't tell you the number of places where all of a sudden, you know, like, it's not for anything that I've done, but it's because of the imaginaries that have been projected onto me. You know, that people start saying, oh, let me open this door because you are this, or because we want you to be this, we imagine you to be this. And there's no doubt, it's very tricky terrain to navigate, right? Especially if all of a sudden you have access to resources that you didn't before, and there are people with levers of power who are listening to you, but they're listening to you, as you said, as a mascot. So, I mean, like, the important thing, and this sounds trite, but I think it's really serious, is like, how do you keep your own compass, right? How do you keep doing and making decisions from the place that got you to this position, right? Because as soon as you lose that compass, as soon as you kind of start cheaply giving it away to people who are just trying to get you to, like, you know, oh, well, understand power differently. If you don't have a good bullshit meter, right, then you give away your own power. So you have to have incredible confidence in what got you to this position, and know that that's the source of your strength, not what anybody else gives you, not how anybody else names you, not how anybody else tries to claim you. And you have to walk with the confidence that everybody who you were a part of, who you helped, who helped you, like, that's where your compass comes from. That's what I would say. Thank you, thank you.
All right. So, first of all, that was phenomenal. And I'm geeking out hard. And I am low-key mad at you for coming out with this book after my dissertation was written, because I really could have used it when I was writing it. But it's like, I've honestly, like, I have not wanted to think about that part of my life until picking up your book. It got me excited the way I once was when I first started studying this stuff. So I wanted to thank you for that.
Thank you.
And I wanted to, given that we're in a bookstore that is a organizing space in and of itself, I wanted to sort of ask about that, because I feel like where my interest in this work and where my work on Ricardo Flores Magón came from started when I learned about how influenced he and Enrique and others were by Camilo Arriaga's library in San Luis Potosí, right? And it was like this famous library that he had imported a shit ton of radical literature. You know, they were reading Bakunin, they were reading everybody. And then, like, he carried that forward, right, in bookstores in LA, the Leavenworth Penitentiary. But I think what's so exciting about the way you approach it is that it's not as easy as just saying, like, oh, this was international because they had access to other texts and other ideas and ways of thinking that they were imported from Europe. There was a debate. There was a sort of kinetic clash of, you know, Mexican people trying to fight for liberation, coming into contact with these ideas and working them out in a really unique sort of way. So I guess I wanted to sort of ask, like, how you approach that, like, historicizing that. Because I felt like I always was looking for sources like, well, what were they saying? What were they arguing about? What ideas were unique from Ricardo after Bakunin? I guess, like, how did you approach that question as a historian? Does that make sense?
I think so, yeah. And I really would love to talk to you about your dissertation, too. You know, I'll say this, that I think two things. The first is that, you know, I kind of came up in a cohort with a lot of activists and organizers who sometimes would have trouble at the seminar table saying, like, but what do real people think? But this is, you know, and I'd be like, have you ever been to an organizer's house? Like, there's nothing but a ton of books, right? This anti-intellectualism that imagines that there's a certain kind of intellectual labor that happens in rarefied places, but then organizers, you know, just kind of think from their gut is so offensive. It's so offensive. So I think that that's how it is, you know? I mean, the best read people I've ever met have all been organizers. But I'm going to answer this this is what's coming to mind. You know, I think sometimes we don't fully credit the kind of intellectual convergences that happen So, you know, Marcus Rediker's book on the Amistad Rebellion, I think is a really is a book I keep going back to. So, you know, for those of you who don't know or didn't see the weird Anthony Hopkins movie that came out in the 90s, you know, there was this extraordinary rebellion on a slave ship. Enslaved people took over the ship, you know, and it's an extraordinary story. You know, we're able to essentially chart their way through many struggles, and they ultimately freed themselves. But he tells this really deep story in one of the chapters about, like, well, what was that discussion in the hold? And I think that there's some really, like, kind of, there are ways we flatten African history, right, where people just imagine, well, I mean, they were enslaved African people, they were going through the same condition. Obviously, they should have been able to communicate with each other. And he's like, okay, but no, they came from different places. They had different languages. They had different religions. Some of them, like, had no contact with each other at all. Some of them were at war. Some of them, like, you know, this was as complicated as any kind of organizing. So he really goes through, you know, in some really deep detail to be able to say, who were these men, right? What was their, you know, what was their background in terms of, like, what work did they do? What kind of skills did they bring to the table? And how do you understand how incredibly complicated it was to produce this kind of convergent spaces, you know, in a space where we would imagine was relatively undifferentiated. So, you know, I mean, it's to those kind of works that I turn, I guess, as a historian, to be able to say it's not just the question of how do we intellectualize this, but how do we make sense of struggles and places and people that are often off our radar as ever doing the kind of intellectual labor. So that's kind of how I'd start to answer that. Thank you for the question.
Can you expand on, that makes me think of How to Make a Dress. Can you tell us the story of Elizabeth Catlett and How to Make a Dress?
So, so Elizabeth Catlett, how many of you have ever heard of Elizabeth Catlett? Oh boy, okay, great. So Elizabeth Catlett did the cover. I have the, yeah, right. I mean, she passed, unfortunately, relatively recently. She was, as Melanie Herzog, her biography describes, like one of the most important artists of the 20th century. She was an African-American printmaker, sculptor. If you go into the homes of a lot of older radicals, particularly black radicals, you will see her artwork on the walls, you will see her sculptures. And what a lot of people, I mean, part of the reason she falls off the map is because she was blacklisted, she lived most of her life in Mexico, and she was denied entry back in the United States. The story I tell of her is this kind of, I tried to solve this mystery, which is that I went to look at there's a group in Mexico, an internationalist artist collective called the Taller de Gráfica Popular. They're based in Mexico City. And they did this whole series on the history of the Mexican Revolution. And I thought this would be interesting to see how artists, you know, around 46 were narrating the Mexican Revolution. What events were they highlighting? How were they doing it? But in the same box, there was this whole series called The Black Woman. And it was done by Elizabeth Catlett. And in that series, she highlights figures like Phyllis Wheatley, Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman. She highlights the struggle of black women in, you know, organizing unemployed workers, of fighting segregation in housing and buses and education. And this is all in 46. So first I had to be like, what the heck is this doing in the same box? And then when I started going through the images, I was like, oh my God, these were definitely done in dialogue with each other, like the way Pancho Villa or Zapata is just figured. There's very similar ways in stylistically that Tubman and Sojourner Truth, you know, are figured. And then there are these other like little stylistic elements. So I was like, oh God, they were really talking to each other. And when I came to this image where Catlett had done a picture of a black man who had been lynched, and Alfredo Zalce had done this image of an indigenous peasant who looks like he's being trampled over by all these French and British capitalists, right? Who are, like, interestingly, to talk about nostalgia, you know, have this fake indigenous person in the middle of their parade. And I was like, now, like, the gestures of the wrists, the kind of, like, way the background and foreground are kind of ambiguous. Like, I was like, okay, so this is not just interesting as a kind of stylistic conversation. There's a political dialogue happening here. So that chapter, How to Make a Dress, tries to think about that and tries to think about what sort of convergent spaces Catlett was a part of before she went to Mexico that really kind of gave her this, I think, fascinating internationalist consciousness that placed black domestic workers at the center of the global class struggle.
And How to Make a Dress is the name of a course that she taught in one of these incredible convergence spaces where she's doing precisely the kind of thing that you're talking about here. She's working with working class, poor women in Harlem and teaching a class called How to Make a Dress. And you narrate this incredible thing where, you know, somebody asks her, how can you teach Marxism in this kind of class? And she says the incredible thing that she says back, which you quoted yesterday.
Yeah, she's like, we just talk,
Right.
you know, and we talk, and you know, and we say we talk about, you know, like the news and who writes the news and who they write it for and what they think about black people, and you know, and the sense you get is they talk in the process of making a dress. She learns all about these women's lives, you know, where do they live, how often do they have a material that doesn't show stains as often, because a lot of them live in homes where they, or in you know, single room occupancy hotels where they have to share a sink with somebody, right? So, so this is the story that I tell.
Yeah, so cool. Thanks.
Thanks. You kind of referenced it a little bit in what you've already said. Obviously, with Leavenworth, Elizabeth Catlett's move to Mexico. I'm wondering if you could just say more about state repression and how much that affected the opportunities and choices that these people had to make, why they were coming together, how they were also broken apart. It seems like this is a thread. I haven't read the book yet, but it seems like there's a thread that goes throughout. So, you know, state repression both inside the U.S. and then outside the U.S. How is this how much of this is a key factor in understanding this history of radicalism and internationalism throughout the 20th century?
Well, thanks, Stuart. I think I might answer that kind of where I started with this great question you had about Alan Knight and internationalism. So, you know, Catlett says in this interview in 71, she's like, you know, Mexico has always given refuge to the revolutionaries of the world, right? And there's a really interesting, I mean, you know, if I had to do a part 2, I'd probably talk about Catlett's home in the 60s and 70s, because I mean, by the records of all kinds of interesting radicals, like her home was a refuge, was a convergence space for people escaping state repression all over the world. So very famously, you know, like people who organized with the Black Panthers, people who were fighting racist state repression against black radicals in the US, like both in the 60s and the 70s, and also people like Harry Haywood in an earlier period, black Bolsheviks, found refuge with Catlett. This was also true for people that were escaping fascism from Franco's Spain. There's like, you know, an extraordinary way in which Mexico has been a refuge for revolutionaries from around the world. I mean, hell, this is where Che and Castro meet to plan this little campaign some of you might have heard of. So, you know, I mean, there's definitely an incredible story about how, because of some of the contradictions of the world, like people who are either opposing or suffering state repression in different contexts end up in Mexico. And so it does, in these different ways, become a fascinating convergence space of the kind of radical internationalism I'm trying to trace.
Thanks.
Thanks so much. This is a question about the cynicism about organizing across structural antagonisms. And I'm thinking, what has me thinking about this is Catlett and her work at the Carver School, and how, for instance, like Harold Cruz, for instance, talked about that school in a highly skeptical way, in part because there were like both black and white people there, and there were middle-class people teaching working-class people, and that this, like, for Cruz, like, took all the revolutionary capacity out of the Carver School. Like, while obviously, like, the account you're providing suggests precisely the opposite, that this was like a transformative experience for Catlett that made her work like with Mexican revolutionaries possible. So maybe I'm like answering the question for you, but I'm just, but I would love to hear you talk about
Are
like.
you Andy Hines.
I am, yeah. Sorry.
Andy Hines has just written an incredible book about this, so you should, I mean, so you've answered
Sorry.
the question, and there's also
And
a
no,
fantastic book.
Anyways, it's nice to meet you. But I would just love, because I'm thinking a lot about organizing across the structural antagonism is a phrase that Ruth Wilson Gilmore uses. And so I just would be interested to hear how you're thinking about it in this book and just generally, because it seems like it addresses that challenge.
Yeah. You know, I mean, there's a lot of feminist organizers that I follow in this book who kind of all weirdly have these profound things to say about their time in Mexico or their time in relationship to the Mexican Revolution. You know, someone in relationship to the question that you're asking. So, you know, Mother Jones is in Mexico in 1921, and she sees this whole incredible demonstration for the Haymarket martyrs. And she's like, this is the most remarkable demonstration of international solidarity I have ever witnessed. Dorothy Healy, she's organizing, you know, these unemployed councils. She's organizing these farm workers. She's kind of going between the city and the rural areas of Southern California. And she's talking about encountering people who have a relationship to the Mexican Revolution. She's encountering people who, you know, kind of learn to organize there. And she also talks about these experiences as being some of the most formative in her whole, I mean, this is towards the end of her life. She's looking back, these were some of the most formative experiences. And Catlett too. Catlett describes this as this complete turning point for her. So Catlett taught at something called the George Washington Carver School in Harlem on 125th Street that Christy mentioned. And it was, you know, this very radical school where people who had been blacklisted at other schools came and taught. There were teachers from Juilliard. There were teachers who had gotten blacklisted from City College who taught there. And, you know, I quote the Chicago Defender article where the students yeah, I mean, this is a really unique space. There are black and white students and teachers, and this is not really happening anywhere else, but you get a sense that people really have love for each other here, and this is unusual. So, I mean, I'll just say that I think two things. First, that Catlett similarly says that her engagement with particularly black working class women, but black working class people in this space, transformed her. You know, I kind of argue that the first image she does in Mexico is of a domestic worker. Domestic workers figure really prominently in the black woman. You know, people who I've interviewed that knew her talk about how moving it was for her to have a sense of black domestic workers who were the most heavily unionized and organized in that period. So, you know, I think that the kind of record shows that this was an incredible space for the people who were involved. It was a collective space. It only existed because people built the chairs and painted the walls and talked to each other. But I'll say that, you know, some of this is also, what histories are you rewarded for telling, right? I mean, any of you that are writing a book now or thinking about it, you have to understand some of the seductions. I mean, this question you asked earlier about mascot, this also applies to writing history.
Yep.
What was I told to do when I proposed this project? People said, oh, so you want to write a book about mixed race people, right? Oh, so you want to write about Asian people, right? Because, and, you know, I probably could have, it's a nice coat, but I could have a really nice coat if I just was stayed in my lane. So you get incredibly rewarded for telling histories of impossibility, right? By saying this is just it's not possible now, it's never been possible in the past. And so uncovering a record that says, you know, we have to give people more credit for what they tried to negotiate and work through. You probably, you know, you may not get rewarded in the same way as if you play into this. You know, I will be your mascot. I will tell the history of impossibility and that this only applied to me and my group and my embodied identity in the way you imagine it. But that's irresponsible to history as it has unfolded, I think.
Thank you.
I think we have time for one more question. Anybody? Any closing comments? Any questions, Christina, that you want to ask Christy?
Oh,
Turn the tables?
Put me on the spot.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh, cool.
Okay.
Kind of getting a same mindset and stuff like that. And you know when you start on this journey and stuff like that, I think you can understand that it's a lonely journey. You understand? And you got to get over a lot of stuff that you used to held beliefs, because the conditioning, how this stuff is set up against people like me and you. You understand?
Yeah.
Me and you.
Yep.
You understand?
Mm-hmm.
You say like black and yes, all the whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, it's a lot sometimes to go back and clear your mind out. A lot of things that you use to hold beliefs in and stuff like that. But what I would say is like who is holding the farm revolutions and understanding chaos. If you get so the farm revolutions and just understanding chaos.
Yeah.
Like understand, because I understand chaos a lot, but just like I like to get information from other people, like better than myself. You know what I'm saying? Because it's just like I feel like they be saying they confirm what I like. All right, I'm on the right path. When I hear something from a random stranger from outside in the street or something like that, hey, I was like, oh, I was just reading that. You know what I'm saying? Like that type of thing. So I'd rather that than me reading like 100 pages in a book every day or something like that. You know what I'm saying? So, all right, that's all I got to say.
That's a really great question. I really appreciate that, both of them. Yeah, and the farm revolution. So here's the thing about rural organizing and farm workers is I think that there's, and I try to address in the book, I think there's a lot more to say, but part of the reason that it's thank you. I think one of the things is we do have a really like bifurcated, segregated imaginary of who does what work where, right? And if you actually look at the record, like for example, the chapter about the unemployed workers that I write about, and the farm workers, 5, how to make a living. So Dorothy Healy is organizing these farm workers in the Imperial Valley, where my great uncle was from. There are Japanese, Okinawan, Black, Mexican, Filipino, South Asian, poor white. Like if you go to the cemetery in the Imperial Valley, it's extraordinary. The whole world is there, right? So she's organizing in that space, and then she's also organizing in Los Angeles. She's organizing unemployed workers during the Great Depression. Now here's the crazy thing. They were the same people. Not all the time, but like agricultural work is seasonal work, right? Dorothy Healy, it's in chapter 5. It's the first paragraph. So, what happens, like, agricultural work is seasonal work, right? And so the story was in the off season, when people were done picking lettuce in the Imperial Valley or cherries in Lodi or, going up the whole coast, in the off season, especially when it's cold, they would go to cities like Los Angeles and try to eke out a living, often through mutual aid societies, often leaning on like gendered labor, the kind of like piecemeal work that particularly like Mexican women were doing under the table. And so like, and there were all these other stories I discovered about that. I was going to tell this whole subchapter about the green corn revolution in Oklahoma, right? And to think about how sharecroppers in that region were actually often oil workers in the off season. And so I think there's like some of the debates that we have about what kind of work is happening where, it makes a huge difference. I don't want to oversimplify it, but I think this question of like agricultural organizing, we have to more firmly put it into what we imagine as like urban organizing, because especially if you're thinking about city farming, like we have to think about these things together. So I would just sort of start there. Now, chaos. I love chaos. You have no idea. We could. Absolutely. I do. And so I don't think chaos gets resolved. I think it can be given some shape, right? So the book opens, the introduction is called How to Make a Rope. And I try to put some order to the chaos I encountered. I try to tell the story of turn of the century lynch rope and how it was made. Because the strands of the rope, there are strands that come from the Philippines, right? The fiber was called Manila or Abaca, right? And it comes from U.S. imperial control over the Philippines. There are strands called henequen or sisal. They come from, the southern Mexican state of Yucatan. That the U.S. companies own 99.8% of the entire trade. There are strands of cotton rope that come from Jim Crow sharecropping regimes in the South. So you think about the whole world kind of tied together, twisted together in the production of this instrument of racist terror. But I open the book by saying, but if you unbraid the strands of accumulation, you start to understand how the whole world is tied together in struggle as well. So, I'm a big fan of starting with the chaos and, like you said, trying to figure out what resonates and not trying to completely resolve it, but try to give some order to what's resonating with you, because chaos usually speaks to you, you know what I'm saying? So I appreciate the question.
All right. I think that's probably a great place to end. So please join me in thanking Christy and Christina for this lovely conversation. Also, buy the book. Buy the books. Arise is really beautifully written, and it's really, I think, a real treat. So please pick it up.